And I promise I won't go long because I know it's been a long day for everyone. So what I want to do is talk about supporting women veterans who have been morally injured by toxic leaders. And this is more of a more of a discussion. I want to hear more input from you rather than necessarily doing a lot of talking. I'm going to sort of lay out some ideas, but then I really want to hear from you about it. So there's been some previous work on toxic leadership in the literature, and then in my own research with Dr. Kovacic, we looked at women veterans' experience with moral injury, and some of them referred to toxic leadership. So we'll kind of briefly cover previous work on toxic leadership in the literature. We'll have some discussion about toxic leadership in various environments, and then talk about how do we help survivors. Chen and Sun did a piece on leadership ostracism, and they characterized it as excluding or rejecting, ignoring, neglecting, or shunning, and frequently occurs with other forms of toxic behaviors such as bullying. And we'll share my screen here real quick just so you can see what I'm looking at. So the implications of his leadership, or the implications of his research, or their research, I should say, sorry. The narcissistic tendencies, power awareness, stereotypes, and results orientation may trigger or ostracism inclination of a supervisor. In other words, supervisors that tend to be narcissistic, or if they have a lot of awareness about power in an organization, who has it, who should have it, authorities, that kind of thing, if they tend to operate in stereotypes, then they are more likely to be inclined toward ostracism of those that are not performing well, right? So, or for those who do not, toe the company line. Now, it's interesting, subordinates can contribute to ostracism in a toxic culture, and not all these things are necessarily bad, but if you have a toxic culture situation, then these are factors that are likely that factors that a subordinate may possess that may contribute to ostracism. If they lack political skills, or they have disregard for organizational rules or culture, we probably all know of someone who just is kind of a bull in a china shop, or just is really either lost on cultural norms in that environment, or they just don't care. And they are 100% themselves, and sometimes they can be abrasive, sometimes they're not, but they just they don't care about fitting in and so on. So if you have an environment that's toxic, those people tend to be targets. If they're unwilling to seek personal favors or kowtow to toxic leaders, and if they have low self-esteem, that can sometimes make them easy targets, easy victims, or low job performance. And we kind of, for a lot of women who were assaulted or harassed, oftentimes it was the woman who also wasn't performing well physically or as a military person. And it could have been because of the harassment, they didn't perform well, or maybe they weren't necessarily a high performer, but instead of coaching and mentoring them, they got ostracized or attacked. LeBrage looked at toxic leadership in the nursing field, said that characteristics of toxic leaders lack of temperance, emotional control, narcissistic, tended to humiliate subordinates. And what's interesting is a toxic nurse leaders, or it could be doctors in a nursing environment, it also was associated with increased negative patient outcomes. So more patient and family complaints, patient and family of verbal abuse of nurses, patient falls, and medication errors. Oftentimes when you have a toxic environment, and I saw this in deployments where one commander was created this environment within the company, the officers abused the non-commissioned officers, who abused the privates, who then abused the civilians out there in the deployed environment. This was in Kosovo. So creating a toxic environment not only hurts the workers, but it can also hurt the customers because of the snowballing kind of effects. And then Williams said that in their research where they interviewed, surveyed people about toxic leaders, they found that for every 18 years of service, the average was nearly 3 toxic leaders in the military. And you can see leader behaviors: lack of self-awareness, negative interpersonal style, passive hostility, defensiveness, suspicion of others, no allowance for dissenting opinions. We probably all have at some point in our career worked for someone like that. And that results in, again, degraded military performance, reduced government efficiency, and lack of retention. All common sense factors. Then in our own research, Roberts, myself, and Dr. Kovacic, we found that toxic leaders were associated with toxic leadership was associated with emotional issues, diminished self-worth, mental issues, relationship problems, career deterioration and loss, physical injuries and illness. So all these issues were associated with moral injury, specifically within the context of toxic leadership. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And what I'd like to ask is, if you have been subject to a toxic leader or know someone who has, how did you or they survive or cope with the experience? So that's something for you to let me know about. If you have been subject to a toxic leader or know someone who has, how did you or they survive or cope with the experience? This is my chance to learn from you. So Constance said avoidance and counseling. And yeah, that's hard to do, right? It's hard to avoid because sometimes, toxic leaders, they're in your face all the time. Or if you work on a small staff with only a few people, it's hard to avoid them all the time. Doug says wait it out, and that's hard because it seems like if you have a really good commander, normally they're in command for about 2 years, and it just, you don't want them to leave. But if you have a really tough commander or boss, 2 years is an eternity when there's a toxic leader situation. And because of the way, military is often structured, but this is a lot of other jobs. You can't just fire people because they're a-holes. I mean, that we want to be able to do that, but you it's hard to fire people. And so you often end up stuck with these leaders, even that everybody knows maybe they're bad. But the lack of legal, strength or ability to just fire them or move them on makes it difficult for everybody. Going to church and praying. So Karen Brake brought up a good point. Sometimes you have, how do you separate the personality disorder, narcissistic, toxic leader from the leader who's actually a normally good person but is toxic now because of the stress they themselves are under? And it's a good question, because sometimes in, like, for instance, in the military environment, but this can happen in the medical field and other fields, you're under so much pressure, and you have these requirements from higher that you can't possibly meet, and there's no let up, like there's no understanding of, hey, I cannot possibly meet all these requirements, and you're expected to do it, or you're expected to lie about it, just turn the reds into greens, whatever it takes on the little metrics chart. And so that can push somebody into being a toxic leader, when in actuality they're a good person who's just trying to survive the toxicity that they're under. And again, I go back to Kosovo, where the officers abused the NCOs, who abused the privates, who abused the civilians. And it just became this thing where, as I was not in that company, but I observed it a lot. And I saw, hey, as a non-commissioned officer, would I be able to hold up under that pressure when it just happened constantly, all the time? And, it takes a very strong person not to give in to that kind of pressure, especially when you're expected to produce results, even if you don't have the resources to do it. Yep. And Angela says you feel alone and vulnerable, and that can be very true. Okay, so there's an expression, hurt people hurt people. What does that mean to you in the context of toxic leadership? And we kind of covered it a little bit, but want to know if you have any additional comments about that. Hurt people hurt people. So the most important toxic environments are easily passed on to the environments you interact with. That's a good way to say it. It's like you create this poison gas environment, and it floats and goes to other people. It affects other people. I mean, you think about it as a chaplain, maybe, or a psychologist, for instance, in a toxic environment. How likely is it that over time, with enough toxicity going on, you lose your compassion for people that are seeking your help, or you just lose the emotional ability to be present with them because you're under so much stress yourself. Yeah, so as Angela talks about, people hurt people often project their own pain onto others, and it's a way of like not thinking about their own pain or ignoring their own pain. um it it helps them focus on harming others. Now the $1 million question is, how do we help those people? um with just a few minutes here, how do we help those people who are in a toxic environment? As a chaplain or a psychologist or social worker or counselor, whatever it is, or just a friend, how can you help someone? They come to you, and this has happened to me, many times, where people explain that they're in a toxic environment. It's very difficult. How can I help them? What can I say to them? How can I um, be there for them when I can't necessarily change the environment they're in? Offer workshops with the unit about moral injury. Certainly, we can do that. Yep. Yep. So Meredith brings up a good point. By validating their feelings, letting them know that that we acknowledge their feelings and that they're real, because people in that support kind of environment are made to doubt their feelings. Often there's gaslighting going on and ostracism. And so you can begin to think, well, am I the crazy one? Am I the one that's, and I've seen that. There's a woman I counsel regularly, and, she's in an environment at home where her spouse, makes her feel um, like she's the crazy one, invalidates her constantly, and trying to help her understand that, if what she's telling me is true, if what she says is happening to her and what he's doing to her is doing to her, then she's totally within her human rights to feel the way she is, because it's a negative environment, and it makes sense to feel that way. Um, Support groups, yep, that's a good idea. Constance. Jordan says the idea we can't control others' actions, but can control how we react. Yeah, so it really is true that, as difficult as it is to hear and maybe to accept and do, we really are in control of how we choose to feel about something. Um, and in my own counseling with this young woman I just mentioned, one of the things that we talked about is, well, her spouse was making her feel like if she didn't do what he wanted, then she was causing him pain, right? He was, and if, in other words, he was blaming her for everything, rather than taking ownership or responsibility for her own feelings or his own feelings. So she would say, well, I want to do this, or I want to challenge him on this, or I'm thinking about leaving him, or whatever it is, because of a very negative environment. She said, but I know that might cause him to do something bad, and it'd be my fault. And it's like, no, you can't be responsible for other people's actions. But in the same vein, we have to take responsibility for our own feelings. It can be very difficult, but helping someone understand, like, you have the ability at least to think about things how you want, to find ways to um to have some control over your emotions, even in a toxic environment, can be helpful. Yeah, Charles says maybe we can reach out to that toxic person and ask if they need help. I've seen that work actually. And it turned out, as Charles mentioned, the person was overwhelmed. And so when I came to him with just, hey, being nice, I found out, like, I think her grandmother died. And so I just asked, or was sick. This was years ago. And I just, I came up to her and she was like, what do you want? I don't have time. I was like, whoa. I just want to find out, how is your grandmother doing? And it changed her mood instantly, and you could feel like this total change of mood. And we talked for a while, and then she said, I don't mean to snap at you, I'm just so overwhelmed. I get it. I mean, you have a hard job, so I totally understand. I'm not bothered. So those are some things to think about. I know it's a very short session, but I wanted to bring that up, and kind of get some thoughts on that. It is very difficult to help someone in a toxic environment when you can't change that environment for them. But I do think giving them, some keys to it, giving them someone to talk to unload on, to just share their feelings with, can be super helpful. And be willing to offer that as often as they need it, because they may need to talk to you every week, and that's okay. Helping them understand reporting mechanisms, so equal opportunity office, IG office, those are offices I encourage people to use those offices. People are often made to feel like they're disloyal if they go to the EO or IG, but I've encouraged people who work for me, who thought I did something wrong, and I honestly said, look, if you think I've done something wrong, you should report it. Talk to EO or IG and see. And it wasn't a challenge. It wasn't like, hey, it was like, you have your right to do that. But we talked it out. We worked it out. It was fine. I understood where she was coming from, and there was no report. But I told her, I want people to feel comfortable using those. And I encourage people, when people have come to me and said, hey, I'm in a leader that's this way and that way, I encourage them to use those mechanisms, or at least let them know that they're available. So that's another way to help the person have some control. And what was the other thing? And just validating their feelings, letting them know, however they feel about the situation, they have the right to feel that. And many leaders will try to tell people, hey, you shouldn't be upset at this because nobody's violated the rules. Well, sometimes you cannot violate the rules but still treat people in ways that make them feel like they're not being respected. So however you feel about a thing is how you feel. And it's not for me or anybody else to decide whether your feelings are just or right. It's just how you feel. And so, helping people, giving people a non-judgmental space where they can just share. And these toxic leadership environments, they all eventually do end. Leaders do move on. And so we have to figure out, how can we help people in the midst of this, go through this situation. So that's all we have for the day.